Number 1, Cameron Hooker, a marriage planned for murder and a nightmare constructed in the depths of rural California. The story of Cameron Hooker and his victim, Colleen Stan, is one of the most harrowing examples of psychological torment and prolonged captivity in American criminal history, illustrating how a seemingly ordinary family man could harbor an unimaginable darkness behind closed doors. Cameron Hooker was born on November 5, 1953, and grew up in a turbulent household that planted the early seeds of his violent sexual deviances. As a young adult, he became deeply engrossed in sadomasochistic pornography, particularly narratives involving extreme bondage, torture, and total psychological subjugation. By the time he reached his 20s, these dark fantasies had entirely consumed his psyche, blurring the lines between fiction and a terrifying reality he intended to enact. In 1975, he married Janice Hooker, a woman who, despite recognizing her husband's dangerous and escalating sexual appetites, slowly became complicit in his twisted world, initially participating out of fear and later out of a deeply warped sense of loyalty and submission. The couple settled in Red Bluff, a quiet, unassuming city in Northern California, where they raised 2 young daughters and presented a facade of absolute normalcy to their neighbors and community. Behind the walls of their modest home, however, Cameron had been meticulously constructing a soundproof torture chamber beneath the basement, a hidden dungeon equipped with a custom-built wooden box, restraints, and an array of horrific implements designed to break a human being completely. The stage was set for a crime that would defy comprehension. On May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan, a bright and adventurous young woman, was hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's birthday party in Northern California. Standing at a busy intersection, Colleen was picked up by a couple in a green van. Behind the wheel was Cameron Hooker, accompanied by his wife, Janice, and their infant child. The presence of a woman and a baby immediately lowered Colleen's guard, a calculated element of the trap that Cameron had set. As they drove, Cameron pulled a knife on Colleen, forcing her into the back of the van where he placed a makeshift wooden box over her head, blinding and deafening her to the outside world. He then bound her hands and legs with elaborate leather restraints. Colleen was driven to the Hooker residence in Red Bluff, where her harrowing ordeal of 7 years of captivity truly began. Upon arrival at the house, Cameron dragged Colleen down into the basement and locked her inside the wooden box he had built, a coffin-like contraption that measured just 3 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. Underneath the box was a bedpan for her bodily waste, and the only air she received came through a small series of drilled holes. For the first extended period of her captivity, Colleen was kept in this box for up to 23 hours a day, only allowed out to be subjected to horrifying acts of torture, sexual abuse, and psychological manipulation. Cameron introduced Colleen to a strict regime of terror, hanging her by her wrists from the ceiling, whipping her, burning her, and using electroshock to enforce absolute compliance. To break her will entirely, Cameron employed a sophisticated and brutal system of psychological conditioning. He told Colleen that a shadowy, international organization called The Company had purchased her and was monitoring her every move. He fabricated an elaborate mythology, claiming that if she ever attempted to escape, the company would track her down and brutally murder her entire family. To make the threat seem real, Cameron staged fake phone calls, played recordings of people speaking in cryptic terms, and even took Colleen out on highly controlled public outings where he pointed out seemingly random individuals, claiming they were agents of the company, watching her. This profound psychological manipulation effectively destroyed Colleen's will to flee, trapping her in a prison of her own induced paranoia. As the months turned into years, Cameron's control over Colleen evolved. He forced her to sign a slave contract, renaming her Kay, and eventually moved her out of the wooden box and into a locked space under his waterbed, though the torture and abuse continued unabated. In a sickening twist, in 1981, Cameron allowed Colleen to come upstairs and live in the house as a live-in nanny and maid for his children, though she was entirely brainwashed into believing she was still under the absolute control of the company. She was even permitted to visit her family on her own, yet she never revealed her ordeal, so deeply ingrained was the terror that Cameron had instilled in her mind. The case of Colleen Stan is a profound testament to the devastating power of psychological coercion and the fragility of the human mind when subjected to prolonged, methodical torture. The investigation into her disappearance and captivity began in 1984, a full 7 years after she was initially kidnapped, triggered not by a law enforcement breakthrough, but by a moral awakening within the Hooker household itself. Janice Hooker, who had spent years participating in and facilitating the abuse of Colleen Stan, experienced a profound crisis of conscience. Driven by her own religious awakening and a growing terror that Cameron's violent fantasies would eventually be turned on their own young daughters, Janice found the courage to contact the authorities. In August 1984, Janice secretly called the Red Bluff Police Department and provided them with a fragmented but horrifying account of what had been happening in their home. The police, initially skeptical of the bizarre and extreme nature of the claims, launched a preliminary investigation. Detectives arranged to meet with Janice, who provided them with crucial details about the hidden dungeon, the wooden box, and the daily routines of her husband. Convinced that there was enough probable cause to act, the Red Bluff Police Department moved quickly to execute a search warrant on the Hooker residence. When officers arrived at the home, they discovered the horrifying evidence exactly as Janice had described it. In the basement, they found the soundproof torture chamber and the infamous wooden box that had served as Colleen Stan's primary prison for years. More importantly, they found Colleen herself. When the officers informed her that she was free and that the company did not exist, Colleen initially struggled to process the reality of her liberation. The psychological chains that Cameron had forged over 7 years were so strong that the concept of freedom felt like another cruel trick or a test of her obedience. However, as the reality set in and she was physically removed from the environment of her torment, the immense psychological burden began to lift. Cameron Hooker was arrested at his workplace without incident. During his subsequent interrogation, Hooker attempted to rely on the very psychological defenses he had constructed for his victim, initially claiming that Colleen had willingly participated in a consensual sadomasochistic relationship and that she was free to leave at any time. Detectives, however, systematically dismantled this defense by presenting the physical evidence of the torture chamber, the restraints, the wooden box, and the testimony of Janice Hooker, who detailed the systematic abuse, the isolation, and the elaborate fake mythology used to control the young woman. The legal proceedings against Cameron Hooker commenced in 1985, drawing significant media attention due to the extreme and unprecedented nature of the crimes. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Michael McGuire, faced the daunting task of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Colleen Stan had been held against her will through a combination of physical violence and psychological terror, rather than engaging in a consensual arrangement as the defense suggested. The trial featured the powerful and heart-wrenching testimony of Colleen Stan herself, who detailed the years of torture, the terrifying reality of living in the wooden box, and the crippling fear of the fictitious, the company. Forensic psychologists were brought in to explain the phenomenon of traumatic bonding and extreme psychological coercion, educating the jury on how a victim could be conditioned to remain in captivity without physical chains. The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming physical evidence of the dungeon and the corroborating testimony of Janice Hooker, who had turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity from prosecution for her role in the crimes. In November 1985, the jury deliberated for a relatively short period before returning a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and various other charges related to the torture and false imprisonment of Colleen Stan. Cameron Hooker was subsequently sentenced to 104 years in state prison, ensuring that he would never again walk free in society. The aftermath of the trial brought significant attention to the concepts of coercive control, psychological kidnapping, and the devastating effects of long-term trauma. Colleen Stan, displaying remarkable resilience, went on to rebuild her life, eventually earning a degree in accounting and becoming an advocate for victims of abuse. She detailed her harrowing experience in a book co-authored with her therapist, providing invaluable insights into the psychology of survival and the slow, painful process of reclaiming one's identity after such profound dehumanization. Janice Hooker, who escaped prosecution due to her cooperation with the state, vanished from the public eye, living under an assumed name, forever burdened by the guilt of her complicity in one of the most twisted kidnappings in American history. The case of Cameron Hooker remains a stark and chilling landmark in the annals of criminal psychology, serving as a grim reminder of the infinite capacity for human cruelty and the terrifying effectiveness of psychological manipulation when weaponized by a disturbed and calculating mind. It forever changed how law enforcement and the legal system understand the concept of consent in cases of extreme prolonged abuse, establishing that a victim's failure to flee does not equate to willingness, especially when their mind has been systematically broken and reshaped by terror. Number 2, Philip and Nancy Garrido, a monstrous partnership that stole the future of a young girl and hid her in plain sight for 18 years. The crimes committed by Philip and Nancy Garrido represent one of the most staggering failures of the criminal justice system and one of the most profoundly disturbing cases of kidnapping and psychological manipulation in modern history. Philip Gregory Garrido was born on April 5, 1951, in Contra Costa County, California, and from a young age exhibited deeply troubling behavioral patterns. As a teenager and young adult, Garrido developed a severe addiction to drugs, primarily methamphetamine and LSD, which fueled his escalating criminality and warped his sexual impulses. In 1976, his violent tendencies culminated in a horrific crime when he kidnapped a 25-year-old woman in South Lake Tahoe, dragging her into a stolen vehicle and driving her to a secluded warehouse in Reno, Nevada, where he repeatedly raped her over a period of several hours. The victim's courageous decision to testify against her attacker led to Garrido's arrest, conviction, and sentencing in 1977 to 50 years in federal prison and a concurrent term in a Nevada state prison. Astonishingly, despite the extreme severity of his crimes and the lengthy sentence handed down by the court, Philip Garrido was released in 1988 after serving only 11 years, a catastrophic failure of the penal system that would have devastating consequences just a few years later. During his incarceration, Garrido apparently learned to manipulate the system, presenting a reformed facade that convinced parole boards he was no longer a danger to society, a deception that allowed him to walk free and resume his predatory ways. Following his release, Garrido moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area, eventually settling in Antioch, California, where he lived with his wife, Nancy Bocanegra, a woman he had married while he was in prison. Nancy, who held a steady job as a nursing assistant, quickly became entirely subservient to Philip, surrendering her will to his dominant and increasingly psychotic personality. Together, the couple transformed the backyard of their modest home on Walnut Avenue into a hidden, fortified compound, erecting a series of tents, sheds, and soundproof structures obscured from view by heavy tarpaulins, fences, and overgrown vegetation. It was within this concealed labyrinth that they intended to enact Philip Garrido's darkest fantasies. On June 10, 1991, 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard was walking to a school bus stop near her home in South Lake Tahoe, California, accompanied by her stepfather, Carl Probin. As they parted ways, a gray sedan pulled up beside Jaycee, and a woman later identified as Nancy Garrido jumped out, grabbed the young girl, and forced her into the vehicle. Carl Probin witnessed the abduction from a distance and desperately attempted to pursue the car on a bicycle, but the vehicle quickly sped away, vanishing into the morning traffic. A massive search was launched immediately, involving local police, the FBI, and hundreds of volunteers, but despite an exhaustive effort, no trace of Jaycee Dugard was found, and the case gradually went cold, leaving her family devastated and haunted by the agonizing mystery of her disappearance. For the next 18 years, Jaycee Dugard was held captive in the squalid, hidden compound behind the Garrido home. Philip Garrido subjected her to relentless sexual abuse, resulting in Jaycee giving birth to 2 daughters, the first when she was only 14 years old. The children were born in the compound, entirely isolated from the outside world, and knew nothing of normal society, believing that the confined space behind the tents was the entirety of the world. Garrido exerted total psychological control over Jaycee, employing tactics similar to other predatory captors, instilling in her a deep-seated fear of the outside world and convincing her that he was her protector and that if she attempted to escape, she and her children would be harmed. The horror of the situation was compounded by the fact that the Garrido home was visited numerous times over the years by parole officers, utility workers, and even local law enforcement, yet none of them discovered the hidden compound or the 3 hostages living within it. The psychological torment inflicted upon Jaycee was absolute. She was stripped of her identity, robbed of her youth, and forced to endure the unimaginable trauma of raising two children fathered by her captor while remaining completely cut off from her family and the life that had been stolen from her. The intricate web of lies and evasion constructed by Philip Garrido finally began to unravel in August 2009, due to his own hubris and deteriorating mental state. Garrido, who had been running a printing business from his home, had become increasingly obsessed with religious delusions, claiming to hear voices and believing he had discovered a mechanism to control sound and cure schizophrenia. In a bizarre and ultimately fatal error, he took his two daughters, fathered by Jaycee, to the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, to hand out religious tracts and seek approval to hold an event. Their strange behavior and the eerie, rehearsed way the girls spoke caught the attention of two campus police officers, Lisa Campbell and Allison Jacobs, who became deeply suspicious. When Garrido returned for a follow-up meeting, the officers separated him from the girls and began asking them questions. The children's lack of basic socialization and their vague, evasive answers raised massive red flags. A background check on Garrido immediately revealed his status as a registered sex offender on parole for a previous kidnapping and rape. The parole officer, who had been supervising Garrido for years, was contacted, and when confronted, Garrido brought his wife, Nancy, and a woman he introduced as Alyssa, to a meeting with his parole officer. When Alyssa was separated from the Garridos, she confirmed her true identity as Jaycee Dugard, the missing girl from South Lake Tahoe. The revelation sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the public, as the staggering reality of an 18-year captivity hidden in plain sight came to light. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested immediately, and a massive forensic investigation was launched at the Walnut Avenue property. Investigators discovered the hidden compound, a maze of tents, sheds, and makeshift living quarters that had served as a prison for Jaycee and her two daughters. The conditions were described as squalid and deplorable, lacking basic sanitation and modern conveniences, yet equipped with a rudimentary sound system and printed materials that revealed the extent of Philip Garrido's delusional worldview. The legal proceedings against the Garridos were complex and highly publicized, reflecting the immense public outrage over the case and the glaring failures of the parole system that had allowed Philip Garrido to remain unsupervised enough to build a secret prison in his backyard. Philip Garrido eventually pleaded guilty to kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment, and in June 2011, he was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison, ensuring he would never again see the outside of a cell. Nancy Garrido, who had actively participated in the kidnapping and the day-to-day enforcement of Jaycee's captivity, also pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 36 years to life. The trial and subsequent investigations exposed a devastating cascade of systemic failures. It was revealed that Garrido's parole officers had visited his home dozens of times over the 18 years but had never conducted a thorough search of the property, a negligence that allowed the secret compound to remain undetected. Neighbors had also reported suspicious activity and the presence of children in the backyard over the years, but their concerns were largely ignored by authorities. The case prompted a sweeping review of parole procedures in California and led to significant reforms in how sex offenders are monitored and how parole officers are trained to recognize the signs of hidden criminal activity. For Jaycee Dugard, the aftermath of her liberation was a profoundly difficult journey of reintegration and healing. After being reunited with her mother, Terry Probin, Jaycee had to navigate the immense challenge of reconnecting with a world that had moved on without her, while also helping her two daughters, who had never known anything but captivity, adjust to a completely alien reality. With the help of dedicated therapists and the unwavering support of her family, Jaycee slowly began to rebuild her life. She published a memoir detailing her ordeal, which provided a searing and deeply moving account of her resilience and the psychological strategies she employed to survive the unspeakable trauma inflicted upon her. The Garrido case remains a watershed moment in the study of predatory kidnapping and coercive control, highlighting the terrifying reality that monsters can exist behind the most ordinary facades and that the failure of institutional oversight can have catastrophic, lifelong consequences for the most vulnerable members of society. It stands as a chilling reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of absolute darkness and the urgent, non-negotiable need for vigilance in the protection of children. Number 3, Ariel Castro, a decade of darkness in a Cleveland neighborhood where 3 lives were stolen and hidden behind a facade of everyday normalcy. The case of Ariel Castro is one of the most staggering examples of a predatory kidnapper operating in plain sight, transforming an ordinary residential home into a nightmarish prison where 3 young women endured years of brutal physical and psychological torment. Ariel Castro was born on July 10, 1960, in Puerto Rico, before moving to the mainland United States as a child, eventually settling in the Cleveland, Ohio, area. To the outside world, Castro presented himself as a relatively unremarkable member of his community. He was employed as a school bus driver for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, a job that gave him a superficial aura of trustworthiness and put him in regular contact with children and teenagers. He was a musician who played bass guitar in local bands, frequently performing at neighborhood block parties and community events. He had children from different relationships and was known to friends and acquaintances as a charismatic, if somewhat eccentric, figure. However, beneath this carefully constructed veneer of normalcy lurked a deeply violent, manipulative, and predatory individual with a history of severe domestic violence. Long before his crimes as a kidnapper came to light, Castro had demonstrated a terrifying capacity for brutality against the women in his life. Multiple girlfriends and the mother of his children would later report that he had subjected them to vicious physical assaults, death threats, and extreme psychological control. In one particularly horrifying incident, he reportedly beat a woman so severely that she suffered a blood clot in her brain, yet the cycle of violence was allowed to continue without meaningful intervention from the criminal justice system. These early red flags, which hinted at the monstrous darkness within Castro, were ignored or inadequately addressed, allowing him to escalate his predatory behavior to an unimaginable extreme. Castro's home, located at 2207 Seymour Avenue in the impoverished Cleveland neighborhood of Tremont, became the stage for his atrocities. The house was a modest, 2-story structure, but Castro had meticulously modified the interior to serve his sinister purposes. He rigged the interiors of the doors with complex arrays of padlocks, chains, and alarms, creating a series of locked rooms that were virtually impenetrable from the inside. He covered the windows with heavy curtains and soundproofed the rooms to muffle any noise, effectively transforming the residence into a secret, self-contained dungeon where he could exert absolute and unquestioned control over his captives. The first victim to fall into Castro's trap was Michelle Knight. On August 23, 2002, the 21-year-old Michelle, who had a history of personal struggles and was involved in a custody dispute over her young son, was walking down a Cleveland street when she accepted a ride from Castro. Because Castro was somewhat known in the neighborhood, Michelle felt a false sense of security, a fatal mistake that would cost her over a decade of her life. Once inside the house on Seymour Avenue, Castro overpowered her, restrained her, and locked her in an upstairs bedroom. Thus began an 11-year ordeal of unimaginable suffering for Michelle, who became the first of 3 women to be swallowed by the hidden nightmare of 2207 Seymour Avenue. The second victim, Amanda Berry, was kidnapped on April 21, 2003, the eve of her 17th birthday. Amanda was a bright, popular high school student who had just finished a shift at her job at a fast food restaurant and was waiting for a ride home. Castro, who had been stalking her, approached her and offered to take her to her house. Amanda, who did not know Castro well, initially hesitated but eventually got into his vehicle. Instead of taking her home, Castro drove her to Seymour Avenue, dragged her inside, and locked her in a separate room, binding her with ropes and chains. The third victim, Georgina de Jesus, known as Gina, was kidnapped exactly 1 year later, on April 2, 2004. Gina was a 14-year-old friend of Amanda Berry's younger sister. She had spent the day at school and was walking home from a payphone after calling her mother to say she was on her way. Castro, recognizing her from the neighborhood, lured her into his vehicle under the pretense of offering a ride, and she too was taken to the Seymour Avenue house and thrown into the dark, soundproofed prison. Over the ensuing years, the 3 women endured a ceaseless nightmare of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse at the hands of Ariel Castro. They were kept in separate, locked rooms, chained to the floor or to heavy pieces of furniture, and fed only meager rations of food. Castro subjected them to violent beatings, often punching, kicking, and whipping them with objects, sometimes for no reason other than to assert his total dominance. He starved them as a form of punishment, at times restricting their food intake to a single meal every few days, leaving them weak and malnourished. The psychological torture was equally devastating. Castro played cruel mind games with the women, telling them that no one was looking for them, that they were never going to be found, and that he was their entire world. He would pretend to leave the house and then violently punish them if he heard any noise, instilling in them a paralyzing terror of making a sound. He forced them to endure extreme temperatures, keeping the house freezing in the winter and stiflingly hot in the summer, all while they remained chained and helpless. The horror of their captivity was compounded by the fact that Amanda Berry became pregnant as a result of Castro's repeated sexual assaults. In a scene of unimaginable brutality, Castro forced Michelle Knight to assist in the delivery of Amanda's baby in a plastic inflatable swimming pool inside the house, threatening to kill Michelle if the baby did not survive. The baby, a girl named Jocelyn, was born healthy, and Castro eventually allowed Amanda to keep the child in her room, though the child herself was a hostage, growing up in the confined, nightmarish environment without any knowledge of the outside world. Michelle Knight, who bore the brunt of Castro's sadism, became pregnant multiple times as well, but Castro starved her and physically beat her in the stomach to force miscarriages, an act of profound cruelty that caused her immense physical and emotional suffering. For over a decade, the women existed in a state of perpetual terror. Their identities erased, their families left to wonder what had happened to them, and their hope of rescue dwindling to almost nothing. The miraculous escape from Ariel Castro's House of Horrors began on the afternoon of May 6, 2013. Castro had left the house for a brief outing, a rare moment when the interior locks were not fully engaged. Amanda Berry, seizing an opportunity that she had been waiting and preparing for over 10 years, realized that the front door was not bolted. In an act of extraordinary courage and desperation, Amanda pushed the door open and stepped out onto the front porch, the first time she had been outside the house in over a decade. She began screaming for help, attracting the attention of neighbors. A man named Charles Ramsey and another neighbor, Angel Cordero, rushed to the scene. Amanda, clutching her daughter Jocelyn, frantically told them that she was Amanda Berry, that she had been kidnapped, and that she needed the police. Ramsey and Cordero helped Amanda break through the screen door of the house to free the other women inside. When officers from the Cleveland Police Department arrived, they entered the house and discovered Gina De Jesus and Michelle Knight in separate locked rooms. The scene inside the house was described by investigators as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered, a maze of chained doors, boarded-up windows, and deplorable living conditions that bore witness to a decade of unspeakable suffering. Ariel Castro was arrested later that evening after fleeing the scene. He was found in a McDonald's parking lot and taken into custody without incident. During his interrogation, Castro initially attempted to minimize his actions, claiming that the women were there willingly and that he was not a monster, but a good person who had made mistakes. However, the overwhelming physical evidence, including the chains, the restraints, the rigged locks, and the detailed, harrowing testimonies of the 3 survivors, completely dismantled his pathetic attempts at deflection. The prosecution of Ariel Castro moved swiftly, driven by the overwhelming public outrage and the strength of the evidence. In a move that spared the survivors the trauma of a prolonged trial, Castro agreed to a plea deal on July 26, 2013. He pleaded guilty to 937 criminal counts, including kidnapping, rape, aggravated murder for the forced miscarriages of Michelle Knight's pregnancies, and a host of other charges. In exchange for his plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, instead recommending a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 1,000 years to ensure that he would never be released. During his sentencing hearing, Castro maintained his defiant and delusional posture, claiming that he was not a violent person and that the women had a happy life with him, statements that were met with disgust by the judge, the prosecution, and the packed courtroom. The survivors were given the opportunity to address their captor directly, and their statements were powerful, searing indictments of his cruelty. Michelle Knight, in particular, delivered a devastating and unforgettable statement, looking Castro in the eye and telling him that she had spent 11 years in hell and that her spirit was not broken. She declared that God had a plan for her life, a plan that did not include being destroyed by him. She expressed her grief for the children she had lost and her determination to rebuild her life. Judge Michael Russo, condemning Castro's actions in the strongest possible terms, sentenced him to life in prison plus 1,000 years, describing his crimes as extreme, horrific, and depraved. Just 1 month into his sentence, on September 3, 2013, Ariel Castro was found hanging in his cell at the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio. He had used a bedsheet to fashion a noose, ending his life and denying his victims the satisfaction of seeing him serve out the remainder of his natural life in a prison cell. His death was ruled a suicide. The aftermath of the Castro case sent shockwaves through the city of Cleveland and the nation. It prompted a fierce and necessary reckoning with the failures of the Cleveland Police Department, which had been heavily criticized for its handling of the missing persons cases of the 3 women. In the cases of Amanda Berry and Gina De Jesus, investigators had received tips and leads over the years that were not adequately pursued, and Michelle Knight, who had a history of running away, was essentially dismissed by authorities and not even officially listed as a missing person for years. The case led to significant reforms in how missing persons cases, particularly those involving minorities and marginalized individuals, are investigated and prioritized. It also spurred a national conversation about the nature of domestic violence, the warning signs of predatory behavior, and the critical importance of community vigilance. For the 3 survivors, the path to healing has been long and arduous, but they have demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for resilience and renewal. Amanda Berry was reunited with her family and her father, who had never given up hope of finding her. Gina De Jesus returned to her close-knit family and became an advocate for missing children. Michelle Knight, who had endured the most severe abuse and had no family to return to, channeled her pain into helping others, writing a memoir about her ordeal and becoming a powerful voice for victims of trauma and abuse. The house on Seymour Avenue was demolished in 2013, reduced to rubble as a symbolic act of purification for the community and a final, definitive end to the place where so much suffering had occurred. The case of Ariel Castro stands as a harrowing testament to the absolute worst of human depravity, but also to the indomitable strength of the human will to survive, to endure, and ultimately, to overcome the darkest of nightmares. Number 4, Wolfgang Pricklepil, the meticulous engineer of an underground prison beneath a quiet Austrian suburb where he held a teenage girl for over 8 years, demonstrating how a calculating mind can construct an invisible fortress of psychological and physical terror. Wolfgang Pricklepil was born on May 14, 1962, in the town of Hainburg in der Donau, Austria, a quiet and unassuming community not far from the capital city of Vienna. Raised in a middle-class household by his parents, Karl and Waltraud, Wolfgang exhibited traits from an early age that set him apart from his peers. He was described by those who knew him as intensely private, socially awkward, fastidiously neat, and deeply emotionally detached. As he grew into adulthood, these characteristics did not soften but rather hardened into a rigid and secretive personality that resisted any genuine human connection. Pricklepil trained as a telecommunications technician, a profession that suited his highly analytical, detail-oriented mind. He was exceptionally skilled with his hands, capable of undertaking complex engineering and construction projects with precision. For a time, he worked for a major telecommunications company in Vienna, but as the years passed, he became increasingly withdrawn and isolated, eventually leaving his job to live a reclusive existence. He moved into a modest, 2-story house in the Vienna suburb of Strashof, a property that had been purchased by his parents years earlier. To the outside world, Wolfgang Pricklepil was a quiet, unobtrusive neighbor who kept to himself, maintained his property meticulously, and caused no trouble. He had no known romantic relationships, no close friendships, and no apparent social life. Behind this invisible facade, however, Pricklepil was meticulously planning and executing a project of unimaginable horror, utilizing his technical skills to construct a secret, subterranean cell beneath his garage. Over a period of years, Pricklepil secretly excavated a deep bunker beneath the concrete floor of his garage, reinforcing the walls and ceiling with thick concrete and soundproofing the entire structure to ensure that no sound could escape to the world above. The entrance to this underground prison was concealed beneath a heavy concrete slab that could only be opened by an elaborate electronic mechanism controlled by a remote trigger, making it physically impossible for anyone inside to escape without his direct intervention. The cell itself was a windowless, airless space, measuring roughly 6 meters by 3 meters, furnished with a narrow bed, a small sink, a toilet, and a few basic amenities, all designed to sustain a human life in perpetual confinement. Pricklepil also constructed a network of tunnels and additional hidden chambers, creating a subterranean labyrinth that he controlled entirely. This dark, suffocating space was to be the stage for a crime that would shock the Austrian nation and the world. On the morning of March 2, 1998, 10-year-old Natasha Kampusch was walking from her home in Vienna to her elementary school. It was a short, familiar walk that she had done countless times before. As she passed a large white van parked on the street, Pricklepil, who had been stalking her for some time, grabbed the young girl and forced her into the vehicle. He drove rapidly out of Vienna and toward his home in Strashof. During the journey, Natasha struggled and screamed, but Pricklepil had soundproofed the van, ensuring that her cries for help went unheard by anyone on the street. Upon arriving at his house, he dragged the terrified child through the garage and into the secret underground bunker, pulling the heavy concrete slab shut above her, sealing her in a tomb of silence and darkness. For the first 6 months of her captivity, Natasha was not allowed to leave the windowless cell for even a moment. She was kept in total isolation, deprived of sunlight, fresh air, and any human interaction beyond the presence of her captor. Pricklepil subjected her to a brutal regime of psychological conditioning designed to completely destroy her will and break her identity. He forbade her from speaking, punishing any attempt at communication with violence and deprivation. He controlled every aspect of her existence, dictating when she could eat, sleep, and bathe. He shaved her head, an act of profound humiliation designed to strip away her individuality and reduce her to a state of total dependence. He told her that the door was booby-trapped with explosives and that if she attempted to escape, she would be blown up, along with the house and anyone nearby. He fabricated elaborate lies, telling her that her parents had refused to pay a ransom for her and that they did not want her back, a devastating psychological weapon designed to sever her emotional ties to the outside world and force her to rely on him entirely. As the months turned into years, Pricklepil slowly began to modify the terms of Natasha's captivity, not out of mercy, but as a means of deepening his psychological control. He allowed her to spend increasing amounts of time upstairs in the main house, cleaning, cooking, and performing household chores for him. This cruel illusion of normalcy was a sophisticated manipulation tactic, designed to make her feel as though she had a role and a purpose, however warped, and to make the prospect of losing that purpose seem unbearable. He forced her to call him her Meister, meaning master, and required her to address him with absolute subservience. He took her on carefully controlled outings in public, including trips to stores and even ski resorts, but he maintained such a tight psychological grip on her that she never attempted to call for help or flee. He instilled in her a paralyzing, all-consuming fear of the consequences of disobedience, convincing her that he was omniscient and omnipotent, capable of finding her and punishing her no matter where she went. This profound psychological conditioning is a hallmark of the most severe cases of coercive control, a process by which a captor systematically destroys a victim's sense of self, autonomy, and connection to reality, replacing it with a manufactured reality in which the captor is the sole source of life, death, and meaning. The investigation into Natasha Kampusch's disappearance was one of the largest and most high-profile in Austrian history. In the immediate aftermath of her abduction on March 2, 1998, the Vienna police launched a massive manhunt, deploying hundreds of officers, search dogs, and helicopters to comb the area where she was last seen. The white van, which was the only lead, was initially described by witnesses in conflicting terms, leading police to focus on a vehicle that did not match Pricklepil's van, a critical error that delayed the investigation from the very beginning. Over the years, the police investigated thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and searched numerous properties, but they never came close to discovering the secret bunker beneath the garage in Strashof. Pricklepil himself was briefly interviewed by police in the early days of the investigation because his van partially matched the description, but he was able to provide a plausible alibi and was dismissed as a suspect. The case gradually went cold, and Natasha's family, particularly her mother, Brigitta Cerny, was subjected to intense public scrutiny and baseless suspicion, a common and devastating consequence of high-profile missing persons cases. The breakthrough that ended Natasha's 8-year ordeal came on the afternoon of August 23, 2006, and it was born entirely from her own extraordinary courage and resourcefulness. On that day, Pricklepill had taken Natasha upstairs in the house to clean his car, a vacuum cleaner running to muffle any noise. He received a phone call that distracted him, and for a brief, crucial moment, he stepped away, leaving Natasha alone in the garage with the vacuum cleaner running. Recognizing that this might be her only chance, Natasha made a split-second decision to flee. She pushed open the heavy garage door, ran across the garden, and scrambled over a high fence into a neighboring property. She ran through the streets of Strashov, screaming for help, her shaved head hidden under a winter hat. She approached a woman in a garden and frantically identified herself as Natasha Kampusch, the missing girl. The woman, initially stunned, called the police, who arrived within minutes. When officers approached Pricklepill's house, they found it empty. Pricklepill, realizing that Natasha had escaped, had fled the scene. He drove to a nearby location and, in a final act of cowardice and control, threw himself in front of a moving train, ending his life and denying the world the opportunity to interrogate him about his motives and methods. The discovery of the secret bunker beneath Pricklepill's garage sent shockwaves through Austria and the international community. Investigators who descended on the property were astounded by the sophistication and complexity of the underground prison, describing it as a masterwork of engineering designed for a single, sinister purpose. The bunker was meticulously constructed, soundproofed, and equipped with a system of electronic locks and alarms that gave Pricklepill absolute control over the environment. The revelation that such a facility could exist beneath an ordinary suburban home, undetected for over 8 years, was a profound and deeply unsettling realization for the Austrian public. Because Pricklepill had died by suicide, there was no criminal trial to provide a formal legal resolution to the case. However, the Austrian authorities conducted a thorough and extensive investigation into the circumstances of Natasha's captivity and the failures of the initial police investigation. The investigation concluded that the police had made critical errors in the early stages of the search, most notably the failure to correctly identify the vehicle used in the abduction, which had allowed Pricklepill to slip through the net. The case prompted a significant public debate in Austria about the competence and methods of the federal police, leading to internal reviews and reforms in the handling of missing persons investigations. For Natasha Kampusch, the aftermath of her escape was a complex and deeply challenging journey of reintegration into a world she had been violently torn from as a child. She had spent 8 of her most formative years in a state of total subjugation, deprived of education, socialization, and the normal experiences of childhood and adolescence. The psychological scars of her ordeal were immense, and she faced the daunting task of rebuilding her identity, her sense of self, and her relationship with a world that had moved on without her. Remarkably, Natasha displayed an extraordinary degree of resilience and composure in the public eye. She took control of her own narrative, giving carefully considered interviews and eventually writing a memoir in which she detailed her experiences with unflinching honesty and a surprising degree of insight into the psychology of her captor and the dynamics of her own survival. She expressed a complex and, to many, bewildering degree of sympathy for Pricklepill, acknowledging that he was the only human contact she had for 8 years and that the psychological bond between a captive and a captor is not easily understood by those who have not experienced it. This response, while controversial, is entirely consistent with the well-documented psychological phenomenon of traumatic bonding, also known as Stockholm Syndrome, in which a victim develops a deep, often paradoxical emotional attachment to their abuser as a survival mechanism in a situation of total powerlessness. Natasha eventually assumed legal control of Pricklepill's house in Strashov, a decision that puzzled many observers but which she explained as a way of reclaiming the space where her youth had been stolen and preventing it from being turned into a macabre tourist attraction. The case of Wolfgang Pricklepill and Natasha Kampusch remains one of the most haunting and studied cases of kidnapping and coercive control in modern criminal history. It is a chilling reminder of the capacity of a highly intelligent, deeply disturbed individual to construct an invisible world of terror within the heart of a seemingly normal community, and of the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in the face of the most extreme and sustained psychological torment imaginable. The case forced Austrian society to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of law enforcement, the dark undercurrents that can exist behind the most ordinary facades, and the profound and enduring impact of psychological trauma on the human mind. Number 5, Kenneth Parnell, a predatory manipulator who stole a young boy from a California street and warped his mind for 7 years, demonstrating how a convicted sex offender could slip through the cracks of the justice system to destroy a childhood. Kenneth Eugene Parnell was born on September 15, 1931, in Amarillo, Texas, and from the very outset of his life, exhibited a deeply disturbing pattern of predatory behavior toward children that would span decades and leave a trail of shattered lives in its wake. Parnell's criminal history began at an alarmingly young age, with his first known arrest for a sex crime occurring when he was just a teenager. Over the ensuing years, he accumulated a staggering rap sheet that included multiple convictions for kidnapping, molestation, and sexual assault against minors. In 1951, he was convicted of molesting a young boy in California and sent to a state mental hospital, a facility that utterly failed to cure or even contain his predatory impulses. In 1959, he was convicted again, this time for kidnapping and molesting an 8-year-old boy in Bakersfield, California, a crime for which he was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison. Astonishingly and catastrophically, Parnell was paroled after serving just 3 years of that sentence, a decision that would have devastating consequences for another innocent child less than a decade later. Despite his extensive and well-documented history as a repeat sexual predator, the California penal system repeatedly failed to recognize the irredeemable nature of Parnell's dangerousness, releasing him back into society time and time again with minimal supervision and a complete disregard for the safety of the public. By the early 1970s, Parnell was a free man again, drifting through Northern California, working a series of low-paying, transient jobs, and presenting a carefully cultivated facade of a harmless, quiet, and unassuming individual. He was a short, unremarkable man with a receding hairline and a mild demeanor that belied the monstrous darkness within him. It was this ability to appear non-threatening that made him so dangerous, allowing him to operate below the radar of law enforcement and prey upon vulnerable children without arousing suspicion. On December 4, 1972, 7-year-old Stephen Stainer was walking home from school in the small city of Merced, California. Stephen was a bright, energetic, and trusting young boy, the second of 5 children in a close-knit, loving family. As he walked along the road, a car pulled up beside him, and the driver, Kenneth Parnell, asked Stephen if he knew the way to a nearby church. Stephen, being a helpful and polite child, approached the car to give directions. At that moment, Parnell produced a knife, threatened the boy, and forced him into the vehicle. Parnell then drove Stephen hundreds of miles away from his home, eventually taking him to a remote cabin in the Sierra Nevada foothills and later to a series of apartments and motels in various Northern California towns. The psychological torment inflicted upon Stephen Stainer began almost immediately upon his abduction. Parnell, fully aware that a massive search was underway for the missing boy, employed a calculated and cruel strategy to destroy Stephen's connection to his true identity and his family. He told Stephen that his parents, Del and Kay Stainer, could no longer afford to keep him and had given him away, a devastating lie that exploited a young child's deepest fears of abandonment and rejection. To reinforce this lie, Parnell forced Stephen to assume a new identity, renaming him Dennis Gregory Parnell and telling him that he was now his legal father. He enrolled Stephen in schools under this false name, forged documents to create a paper trail, and threatened the boy with violence and death if he ever attempted to reveal his true identity or contact his real family. Over the 7 years of his captivity, Stephen was repeatedly sexually abused by Parnell, who treated him as a combination of a slave, a sexual object, and a surrogate son. The psychological manipulation was relentless and sophisticated, designed to keep Stephen in a state of terrified compliance while simultaneously preventing him from seeking help. Parnell isolated Stephen from any adults who might recognize the signs of abuse, frequently moving from place to place to avoid forming lasting social connections. He instilled in Stephen a deep-seated belief that the outside world was dangerous and untrustworthy and that he, Parnell, was the only person who cared about him. This calculated blend of terror and dependence is a classic hallmark of predatory grooming and coercive control, a method by which an abuser systematically strips a victim of their autonomy, their sense of self, and their connection to reality. For 7 agonizing years, Stephen Stainer lived a fractured and tormented existence, a boy without a true name, a child robbed of his family, his identity, and his innocence, trapped in a prison of psychological lies constructed by a remorseless predator. The Stainer family, meanwhile, was consumed by an agonizing hell of uncertainty and grief. In the immediate aftermath of Stephen's disappearance, the Merced Police Department launched a massive search, involving hundreds of volunteers, search dogs, and detectives. They followed every available lead, including the initial description of the car and a vague composite sketch of the driver, but the investigation quickly hit dead ends. Parnell had taken Stephen far from Merced, and the lack of an effective national system for tracking missing children at the time meant that the trail went cold almost immediately. Stephen's parents, Del and Kay, never gave up hope that their son was alive, but the years of silence and the absence of any tangible progress took a devastating toll on the family. The case of Stephen Stainer became one of the most high-profile missing child cases in California history, and the family's unrelenting search helped fuel the growing national movement for stronger laws and better systems to protect children from predators. The extraordinary chain of events that led to Stephen Stainer's liberation began in February 1980, when Kenneth Parnell, his predatory impulses undiminished by the passage of time, set his sights on a new victim. Parnell, who was then living in Ukiah, California, recruited a young man named Irvin Edward Murphy, a mild and easily manipulated individual, to help him kidnap a young boy from a local elementary school. Murphy, who was either unaware of or willfully blind to Parnell's true intentions, assisted in the abduction of 5-year-old Timothy White on February 14, 1980. When Parnell brought Timothy White to the apartment where he and Stephen were living, something profound and extraordinary happened within Stephen Stainer. After 7 years of psychological subjugation, of being told that his family did not want him, of being stripped of his identity and forced to endure unspeakable abuse, the sight of another innocent child being subjected to the same nightmare ignited a spark of defiance and moral courage that Parnell had failed to extinguish. Stephen, who was then 14 years old, made a conscious and incredibly brave decision that he was not going to allow Timothy White to suffer the same fate he had endured. On March 1, 1980, while Parnell was away at work, Stephen took Timothy White, fled the apartment, and hitchhiked to the Ukiah Police Department. When they arrived at the station, Stephen walked up to the desk and delivered words that would shatter the 7-year silence and change the course of multiple lives forever. He told the officers that his name was not Dennis Parnell, but Stephen Stainer, that he had been kidnapped 7 years ago from Merced, California, and that the boy with him, Timothy White, had also been kidnapped by the same man. The officers at the Ukiah Police Department were initially stunned and skeptical, as the disappearance of Stephen Stainer was a well-known cold case, but the details Stephen provided were too specific and too accurate to be dismissed. They immediately contacted the Merced Police Department and the Stainer family, confirming Stephen's identity beyond any doubt. Kenneth Parnell was arrested shortly thereafter at his workplace without incident. When confronted by police, Parnell attempted to maintain his usual facade of innocence, claiming that Stephen was his son and that the boy was confused or lying, but the overwhelming evidence of Stephen's true identity, the forged documents, and the testimony of Irvin Murphy, who confessed to his role in the kidnapping of Timothy White, completely dismantled his defense. The legal proceedings against Kenneth Parnell exposed the full, horrifying extent of his predatory career and the catastrophic failures of the criminal justice system that had allowed him to remain free. In 1981, Parnell was tried in a California court on charges of kidnapping both Stephen Stainer and Timothy White. In a deeply controversial and widely criticized decision, prosecutors chose not to charge Parnell with the numerous counts of sexual assault that Stephen had disclosed, citing concerns about the traumatic impact of a trial on the young victim. Instead, Parnell was convicted solely on the kidnapping charges and was sentenced to a mere 7 years in prison, a sentence that was widely condemned as grossly inadequate given the severity of his crimes and his extensive history as a repeat sex offender. He was paroled after serving just 5 years of that sentence, a decision that once again demonstrated the systemic failure to protect the public from a known, irredeemable predator. The aftermath of Steven Stainer's rescue was a complex and bittersweet journey of reintegration. Steven returned to his family in Merced, but the reunion was far from the simple, joyful homecoming that many had expected. 7 years of profound psychological abuse and identity erosion had fundamentally altered Steven, and the boy who returned was not the same boy who had been taken. He struggled profoundly with the psychological aftermath of his captivity, grappling with feelings of anger, confusion, and alienation. He found it difficult to reconnect with siblings who had grown up without him and with parents who were now essentially strangers. He also struggled with the sudden and overwhelming media attention that followed his rescue, which treated him as a hero but failed to fully comprehend the depth of his psychological wounds. In a tragic and deeply saddening irony, Steven Stainer's life after his rescue was marked by continued hardship and struggle. He married, had 2 children, and worked a series of blue-collar jobs, but he never fully escaped the shadow of his trauma. On September 16, 1989, Steven was killed in a motorcycle accident at the age of 24, a devastating and premature end to a life that had already endured so much. His death was a profound tragedy that underscored the lifelong and often invisible scars left by childhood trauma and kidnapping. Kenneth Parnell, meanwhile, continued to offend even after his release from prison for the Stainer kidnapping. In 2003, nearly 20 years after his parole, Parnell, who was then 71 years old, attempted to purchase a 4-year-old boy for $500 from a woman he knew, demonstrating that his predatory impulses remained as active and as dangerous as ever. He was arrested in an undercover sting operation and charged with attempted kidnapping and solicitation to commit a sex crime. In 2004, he was convicted and finally sentenced to a term of 25 years to life in prison, a sentence that, while welcome, came decades too late to protect the children he had already destroyed. Parnell died in prison on January 21, 2008, at the age of 76, having never expressed a single ounce of genuine remorse for the incalculable suffering he had caused. The case of Kenneth Parnell and Steven Stainer became a landmark in the history of child protection in the United States. Steven's story, which was later dramatized in the critically acclaimed television miniseries I Know My First Name is Steven, helped to galvanize public awareness of the epidemic of child abduction and the critical need for systemic reform. It highlighted the devastating consequences of a criminal justice system that failed to adequately monitor and incapacitate repeat sex offenders, and it contributed directly to the passage of stricter laws governing the sentencing, parole, and community notification for convicted sex offenders. Timothy White, the 5-year-old boy whose abduction catalyzed Steven's courageous decision to escape, grew up to become a sheriff's deputy in California, a career choice that was a direct and powerful response to the trauma of his own brief captivity and the heroism of the boy who had saved him. The story of Steven Stainer is a profound and deeply moving testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of moral courage in the face of overwhelming darkness. It is also a searing indictment of a system that failed repeatedly to protect the most vulnerable, allowing a known predator to strike again and again, leaving a legacy of broken lives and shattered families in his wake. Number 6, Joseph Fritzl, a father who constructed a secret concrete bunker beneath his own home to imprison his own daughter for 24 years, committing crimes of such profound depravity that they shook the very foundations of Austrian society and forced the world to confront the absolute extremes of human malevolence. Joseph Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935, in the town of Emstetten, Austria, a quiet, unremarkable community in the Lower Austria region. His early life was marked by significant trauma and dysfunction, elements that, while not excusing his subsequent actions, provide a disturbing glimpse into the formation of a deeply psychopathic personality. Fritzl was raised primarily by his mother, a woman who was described as a harsh, domineering, and emotionally abusive figure who subjected him to frequent beatings and verbal humiliation. Psychologists who later examined the case theorized that this early environment of terror and subjugation profoundly shaped Fritzl's own developing psyche, instilling in him a need for absolute control and a deeply warped understanding of human relationships, particularly the dynamics between power and submission. As a young adult, Fritzl exhibited disturbing behavioral patterns, including a conviction for a sexual offense in 1967, when he was arrested and convicted of the attempted rape of a 24-year-old woman in Amstetten. He served a short prison sentence for this crime, a fact that was largely forgotten or overlooked in the ensuing decades as he carefully constructed a facade of respectability and normalcy. In 1956, Fritzl married his wife, Rosemary, and over the next 2 decades, the couple had 7 children together. To the outside world, Joseph Fritzl was a pillar of the Amstetten community. He was a qualified electrical engineer who owned and managed several rental properties in the town. He was known as a strict, authoritarian, but generally upstanding citizen who paid his taxes, maintained his properties to a high standard, and socialized with neighbors and acquaintances. He was described as a controlling husband and father who demanded absolute obedience from his wife and children, but this authoritarianism was often dismissed as a generational personality quirk rather than a warning sign of the monstrous darkness that lay beneath the surface. The true horror of Joseph Fritzl's life began to take shape in the late 1970s, when he began the meticulous and secret construction of a subterranean bunker beneath the garden of his family home at Ipstrasse 40 in Amstetten. Using his skills as an electrical engineer and his authority as a property owner, Fritzl obtained building permits for a supposed nuclear fallout shelter, a common construction project during the Cold War era. However, the actual structure he built bore no resemblance to a standard shelter. Over a period of years, he secretly expanded and reinforced the underground space, creating a sprawling, windowless complex of rooms, corridors, and utility areas, all concealed beneath a thick concrete slab that was hidden by a carefully landscaped garden. The entrance to the bunker was located in the basement of the house, concealed behind a series of heavy, electronically controlled doors that were so heavy and so well engineered that they could not be opened from the inside without a remote code. The bunker was equipped with a rudimentary electrical system, a water supply, a small cooking area, and a television, all designed to sustain human life in total isolation from the outside world. Fritzl soundproofed the entire structure to an extraordinary degree, ensuring that no sound, no matter how loud, could escape to the house above or the surrounding neighborhood. This underground prison, which would later become known to the world as the Bunker of Horror, was a masterpiece of engineering designed for a single, unspeakable purpose. On August 28, 1984, Fritzl's carefully laid plans came to fruition when he lured his 18-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, into the basement of the family home. Elizabeth, who had been a victim of her father's controlling and abusive behavior for years, was told that he needed her help to carry a heavy door into the basement. Once inside, Fritzl incapacitated her, handcuffed her, and dragged her into the secret bunker, pulling the heavy doors shut behind them and locking her in a world of darkness and silence that she would not leave for 24 years. After Elizabeth's disappearance, Fritzl executed a meticulously planned cover-up designed to explain her absence and prevent any investigation that might lead to the discovery of the bunker. He forced Elizabeth to write a letter, which he then mailed to his wife, Rosemary, claiming that she had run away from home to join a religious cult and that they should not look for her. He later produced additional letters, supposedly from Elizabeth, indicating that she was living on the streets and did not want to be found. The police, who were notified of Elizabeth's disappearance, accepted Fritzl's explanation at face value and conducted only a cursory investigation, a failure that allowed the horrific deception to continue for over 2 decades. With Elizabeth safely hidden away in the bunker, Joseph Fritzl began a campaign of systematic rape, sexual abuse, and psychological torture that defies comprehension. Over the next 24 years, Fritzl visited the bunker regularly, descending into the underground prison to rape his daughter, often multiple times a week, while his wife and the rest of his family slept obliviously just a few feet above. Elizabeth was entirely cut off from the outside world, deprived of sunlight, fresh air, and any human contact other than her tormentor. She was forced to endure her pregnancies in the squalid, confined space of the bunker, giving birth to 7 children altogether, all fathered by her own father. The conditions in the bunker were described by investigators as cramped, damp, and suffocating, with a constant, oppressive lack of natural light and ventilation. Elizabeth did everything in her power to create a semblance of normalcy for her children, educating them as best she could, establishing routines, and shielding them from the worst of the horror, but the psychological toll of the imprisonment was immense and unrelenting. Of the 7 children Elizabeth bore in the bunker, 3 remained with her in the underground prison for their entire lives, never seeing the light of day or breathing unfiltered air until their liberation. 3 other children were brought upstairs by Fritzl as infants and adopted by him and his wife, Rosemary, who was told that Elizabeth had left them on the doorstep. These 3 children, who were raised in the main house, grew up believing that Elizabeth was their runaway sister, completely unaware that she was living beneath their feet. The 7th child, a twin boy named Michael, died shortly after birth in the bunker due to complications that could have been easily treated in a hospital. Fritzl removed the infant's body from the bunker and incinerated it in the furnace at his workplace, a final, grotesque act of cruelty that denied the child even a proper burial. The psychological torment inflicted upon Elizabeth Fritzl was absolute and all-encompassing. She was stripped of her identity, her freedom, and her fundamental humanity, reduced to a state of total dependence on her abuser for every basic human need. Fritzl controlled every aspect of her existence, dictating when the lights were turned on and off, when she could eat, when she could bathe, and when she could see her children. He used threats, intimidation, and violence to maintain his absolute dominance, telling her that the bunker was booby-trapped with gas canisters that would kill her and her children if she attempted to escape or tamper with the doors. He also used the children as leverage, threatening to harm them or take them away if she disobeyed him. This relentless, multi-generational system of terror and control is one of the most extreme and well-documented cases of coercive control in criminal history, a regime of psychological subjugation so total and so sustained that it is difficult for the human mind to fully grasp its dimensions. The investigation that finally ended the 24-year nightmare of Elizabeth Fritzl began not with a determined detective or an anonymous tip, but with a medical emergency that exposed the hidden world beneath Ipstras 40. In April 2008, Kirsten, the 19-year-old daughter whom Elizabeth had given birth to in the bunker, became seriously ill, suffering from a severe, life-threatening condition that required immediate hospitalization. Fritzl, realizing that he could no longer avoid seeking outside medical help without risking Kirsten's death and drawing unwanted attention to the situation, allowed Elizabeth to accompany Kirsten to the hospital, the first time Elizabeth had been outside the bunker in 24 years. At the hospital, doctors were baffled by Kirsten's condition, which was exacerbated by her extreme lack of exposure to sunlight and fresh air, and by the strange, evasive behavior of her mother. Hospital staff, sensing that something was deeply wrong, contacted the police, who arrived to question Elizabeth. After years of terror and silence, Elizabeth, confronted by authorities and assured that she was safe, broke down and revealed the unimaginable truth about her captivity, the bunker, and the children she had left behind. The police, stunned by the revelations, immediately descended on the Fritzl home and discovered the secret entrance to the bunker in the basement. When they entered the underground prison, they found Elizabeth's 3 children, who had never seen the outside world, living in the cramped, windowless space. The scene was described by veteran investigators as one of the most horrifying they had ever encountered, a living monument to the depths of human depravity. Joseph Fritzl was arrested on April 27, 2008, and taken into custody. During his initial interrogations, he attempted to maintain his usual facade of control and respectability, but the overwhelming evidence of the bunker, the children, and Elizabeth's testimony made any defense impossible. He eventually confessed to the crimes, but in a characteristically manipulative and self-serving manner, claiming that he had locked Elizabeth in the bunker to protect her from the perceived dangers of the outside world and that he had not intended to harm her. This laughable and grotesque justification was rejected outright by investigators, prosecutors, and the public. The trial of Joseph Fritzl took place in March 2009 at the Regional Court in St. Pölten, Austria, and was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in European history. Due to the extreme sensitivity of the case and the profound trauma of the victims, the trial was held largely behind closed doors, with only limited public access to the proceedings. Fritzl faced a battery of charges, including homicide for the death of the infant Michael, rape, incest, false imprisonment, slavery, and coercion. The prosecution, led by Christian Berkheiser, presented a devastating and meticulously documented case that left no room for doubt about Fritzl's guilt or the calculated, systematic nature of his crimes. Elizabeth Fritzl, who had been shielded from the public eye since her liberation, provided a pre-recorded video testimony that was played in court, a 7-hour account of her 24 years of captivity that was so harrowing and so detailed that it left even the most hardened courtroom professionals in tears. The defense, led by Rudolf Mayer, attempted to argue that Fritzl was not fully responsible for his actions due to a severe personality disorder, but the court-appointed psychiatrists who evaluated Fritzl rejected this argument, concluding that he was fully sane, fully aware of his actions, and fully responsible for the monstrous crimes he had committed. On March 19, 2009, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts, and Joseph Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment in a specialized psychiatric facility, where he was to be held in secure conditions for the remainder of his natural life. The judge, Andrea Humer, described Fritzl's crimes as deeds that were beyond all human comprehension, a sentiment that was echoed by the entire Austrian nation and the international community. The aftermath of the Fritzl case was a profound and painful reckoning for Austria, a country that was forced to confront deeply uncomfortable questions about its social fabric, its institutions, and its collective blind spots. The case prompted a fierce and sustained public debate about the failure of the Austrian authorities to detect the crime, despite numerous missed opportunities and red flags over the 24 years of Elizabeth's captivity. Questions were raised about why the police had not investigated Elizabeth's disappearance more thoroughly in 1984, why social services had not been more vigilant in monitoring the Fritzl household, and why neighbors and acquaintances had not reported the suspicious behavior and strange occurrences at the Ypres property. The case also exposed significant flaws in the Austrian system for monitoring convicted sex offenders, as Fritzl's prior conviction for attempted rape in 1967 had not prevented him from obtaining building permits for the bunker or from adopting the children he had fathered with his own daughter. In the years following the trial, Elizabeth Fritzl and her 6 surviving children were provided with new identities and relocated to an undisclosed location, where they have lived in strict seclusion, shielded from the intense media scrutiny and public fascination that the case generated. Reports have indicated that Elizabeth has devoted herself to caring for her children and rebuilding their lives from the ground up, a process that has been described by those close to the family as slow, painful, and extraordinarily difficult, but marked by a remarkable degree of resilience and mutual support. The house at Ypres 40 was demolished in 2013, erased from the landscape as a symbolic act of purification and a final, definitive end to the place where so much suffering had occurred. The case of Joseph Fritzl stands as one of the most extreme, depraved, and horrifying criminal cases in recorded history, a crime that transcends the boundaries of ordinary criminality and enters a realm of malevolence that is almost impossible to comprehend. It is a stark and terrifying reminder that the most monstrous horrors can unfold behind the most ordinary facades, hidden in plain sight, and that the capacity for human cruelty, when fueled by psychopathy, unchecked power, and a complete absence of empathy, knows no limits. Number 7, Richard Osley, a predator who built a buried wooden box in the remote Virginia woods to entomb a 13-year-old boy in darkness, committing an act of calculated psychological destruction that remained hidden for over 3 decades before the full scope of the torment was finally brought to light. Richard Laurie Osley was born on October 20, 1944, and spent his early years moving through the quiet, rural communities of southeastern Virginia, presenting to the outside world as an unremarkable, soft-spoken, and seemingly harmless man. He held various odd jobs over the years, including work as a laborer and a handyman, trades that allowed him to operate largely beneath the radar of society. However, beneath this deliberately bland and unassuming exterior, Osley harbored a deeply pathological and predatory fixation on young boys, a dark compulsion that he meticulously concealed from his family, his acquaintances, and the authorities. His criminal history, which would later prove to be a devastating indictment of the systemic failures of the era, began long before the crime for which he would become most infamous. In the years leading up to his most notorious offense, Osley had been implicated in multiple incidents involving the inappropriate touching and harassment of minors, yet the criminal justice system of the time treated these behaviors with a disturbing leniency that allowed him to escalate his predatory behavior without meaningful intervention or consequence. He learned from each encounter, refining his methods of luring, isolating, and silencing his victims, becoming a more sophisticated and dangerous predator with each passing year. The crime that would ultimately define Richard Osley's legacy and forever alter the life of a young boy occurred on January 12, 1973, in the city of Norfolk, Virginia. On that cold winter afternoon, 13-year-old Paul Martin Andrews, a quiet, slightly built, and trusting boy, was walking home from a local shopping center. Osley, who had been stalking the boy and carefully observing his routines, approached Paul and offered him a ride. Paul, who did not know Osley well but was conditioned by the social norms of the era to trust adults, accepted the offer. Instead of taking Paul home, Osley drove him to a remote, densely wooded area in the Great Dismal Swamp region of Virginia, a vast and desolate expanse of wilderness that Osley had scouted and prepared for this exact purpose. Deep in the woods, Osley revealed the true horror of his plan. He led Paul to a spot where he had constructed a subterranean prison, a buried wooden box that measured approximately 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. The box was entirely underground, covered by a heavy wooden lid and layers of dirt and brush, effectively making it invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Inside the box, the conditions were claustrophobic and nightmarish. It was equipped with a small, inadequate ventilation pipe that allowed a meager trickle of stale air to enter, a bucket for human waste, and a single, dim light bulb powered by a car battery. The temperature inside the box was freezing, as it was January in Virginia, and the thin walls provided almost no insulation against the cold earth. Osley forced the terrified 13-year-old into the box, locked the lid from the outside, and left him there in total darkness and isolation. Over the ensuing 8 days, Richard Osley descended into the woods repeatedly to sexually assault Paul Martin Andrews, using the buried box as a remote, hidden chamber of horrors where he could act out his most depraved fantasies without fear of detection or interruption. Each time Osley arrived, he would unlock the lid, pull the boy out of the suffocating darkness, assault him, and then return him to the box, sealing the lid shut again. The psychological torment inflicted upon Paul during those 8 days was as devastating as the physical abuse. He was trapped in a confined, underground space, buried alive, with no way to call for help and no way to escape. He had no idea where he was, no idea if anyone was looking for him, and no idea if he would ever be found. The sheer terror of being entombed in the earth, combined with the repeated sexual violence, created a state of profound psychological fragmentation that would haunt Paul for the rest of his life. He later described the experience as being like a living death, a state of absolute helplessness and dread that stripped away his sense of self and his connection to the world of the living. The rescue of Paul Martin Andrews was a moment of pure, improbable chance that defied the darkest of odds. On the 8th day of his captivity, Paul, who had been left alone in the box for an extended period, managed to push the heavy wooden lid open just enough to squeeze his body out of the underground prison. He crawled out of the dirt and brush, exhausted, freezing, and in a state of extreme physical and psychological distress, and began stumbling through the woods in search of help. By an extraordinary stroke of fortune, he was spotted by 2 hunters who were driving along a nearby dirt road. The hunters, seeing the disheveled, terrified boy, stopped and picked him up, immediately recognizing that he was in serious trouble. They drove him to the nearest hospital, where medical staff treated him for hypothermia, dehydration, and the physical injuries resulting from the repeated sexual assaults. The police were called, and Paul was able to provide a description of his abductor and the vehicle he had been driving. Richard Osley was arrested a short time later, and the buried box in the woods was discovered by investigators, its horrifying purpose laid bare for all to see. The subsequent legal proceedings against Richard Osley were marked by the profound courage of Paul Martin Andrews, who, despite the extreme trauma he had endured, agreed to testify against his attacker in open court. In an era when the stigma attached to male victims of sexual assault was immense and societal understanding of childhood trauma was woefully inadequate, Paul's decision to face his abuser in a courtroom was an act of extraordinary bravery and resolve. The trial, which took place in 1974, drew significant attention due to the bizarre and horrifying nature of the crime. The prosecution presented the physical evidence of the buried box, the medical documentation of Paul's injuries, and the powerful, searing testimony of the victim himself, who described in graphic detail the 8 days of captivity, the darkness, the cold, and the repeated assaults. The defense, limited by the overwhelming evidence, attempted to portray Osley as a troubled but not irredeemable individual, but the jury was unmoved. Richard Osley was convicted of kidnapping and multiple counts of forcible sodomy and was sentenced to 60 years in the Virginia State Penitentiary, a sentence that, while significant, would prove to be tragically insufficient to protect society from his predatory nature. The aftermath of the trial was a profoundly difficult and isolating experience for Paul Martin Andrews. In the 1970s, there were no specialized trauma services for victims of sexual violence, no victim advocacy programs, and no public understanding of the complex, long-term psychological effects of severe childhood trauma. Paul was left to process the horror of his experience largely on his own, without the support, understanding, or resources that are available to victims today. He struggled for years with the devastating psychological consequences of his captivity, including severe post-traumatic stress disorder, profound depression, debilitating anxiety, and a deep-seated sense of shame and worthlessness that had been instilled in him by his abuser. He turned to alcohol and drugs as a means of self-medication, a common and tragic coping mechanism for untreated trauma survivors, and his life spiraled into a cycle of addiction, instability, and despair. For decades, Paul believed that he was the only victim of Richard Osley, a belief that compounded his isolation and his sense of unique, personal damnation. The true, staggering scope of Richard Osley's predatory career did not come to light until nearly 3 decades after the 1973 crime. In 2002, Paul Martin Andrews, who had been slowly and painfully rebuilding his life with the help of a dedicated therapist, made the courageous decision to reach out to the Virginia Department of Corrections to inquire about Osley's status. He learned to his absolute horror and fury that Osley, despite his 60-year sentence, was scheduled to be paroled in the near future, having served less than 30 years of his sentence due to the lenient parole policies and sentencing practices of the era. Paul, channeling his anger and his trauma into a determined campaign for justice, began advocating against Osley's release, contacting journalists, lawmakers, and victim advocacy organizations to draw attention to the case. His efforts led to a groundbreaking investigation by a dedicated team of journalists and investigators who uncovered a devastating truth that no one had suspected. Through a painstaking review of court records, prison files, and old case files, the investigators discovered that Paul Martin Andrews was not Richard Osley's only victim. In fact, Osley had been convicted in 1958, 15 years before the Andrews case, of a nearly identical crime involving another young boy whom he had lured to a remote location and sexually assaulted. This prior conviction, which should have been a glaring red flag and a basis for a far more severe sentence in the Andrews case, had been inexplicably overlooked or minimized by the criminal justice system. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that while Osley was out on bail pending his trial for the Andrews crime in 1973, he had kidnapped and sexually assaulted yet another young boy, a crime for which he was never prosecuted because the victim, terrified and traumatized, had refused to testify. The revelation of these additional crimes sent shockwaves through the Virginia legal establishment and the public, exposing a catastrophic pattern of systemic failure that had allowed a known, repeat predator to continue offending with impunity for decades. Paul Martin Andrews' courageous advocacy, fueled by the discovery that he was part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior, was instrumental in preventing Osley's parole. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of Osley's lifelong pattern of predatory behavior and the public outcry generated by the media coverage, the Virginia Parole Board reversed its initial decision and denied Osley's release, ensuring that he would remain behind bars for the remainder of his life. In a grim and fitting coda to the story, Richard Osley was murdered in 2004 by a fellow inmate at the Augusta Correctional Center in Virginia, a violent end that brought a measure of closure, if not satisfaction, to the lives he had destroyed. For Paul Martin Andrews, the journey of healing and reclaiming his life has been a long, arduous, and profoundly inspiring process. With the help of trauma-focused therapy and the unwavering support of a small circle of trusted individuals, Paul has slowly and painstakingly rebuilt his sense of self, his dignity, and his purpose. He has become a powerful and eloquent advocate for victims of childhood sexual abuse, speaking publicly about his experiences in an effort to break the stigma, raise awareness, and push for stronger protections for children. His story, which was featured in numerous media outlets and documented in a compelling book about his ordeal, has become a landmark in the understanding of the long-term effects of severe childhood trauma and the critical importance of believing, supporting, and empowering survivors. The case of Richard Osley stands as a searing and damning indictment of a criminal justice system that repeatedly failed to protect the most vulnerable members of society, allowing a known, calculating predator to strike again and again over a period of decades. It is also a testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of a single survivor's courage to confront the past, demand accountability, and forge a path toward healing, not just for himself, but for all those who have suffered in silence. Number 8, Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee, a pair of religious fanatics who kidnapped a 14-year-old girl from her own bedroom and dragged her across the rugged American wilderness, subjecting her to 9 months of profound psychological torment under the guise of divine prophecy. Brian David Mitchell was born on October 18, 1953, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and from his earliest years, he was immersed in the deeply religious culture of the region, surrounded by the traditions, teachings, and authority structures of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, Mitchell's relationship with religion was not one of genuine faith or spiritual seeking, but rather a toxic, egomaniacal obsession that he systematically warped and twisted to serve his own dark, narcissistic desires. As a young man, Mitchell was outwardly charismatic, a gifted singer and street performer who could charm those around him with his musical talents and his seemingly deep spiritual convictions. Beneath this engaging exterior, however, Mitchell was a deeply troubled and volatile individual who struggled with severe mental illness, substance abuse, and a predatory sexual compulsion that he would eventually cloak in the language of religious revelation. He married and had children, but his domestic life was marked by increasing instability, erratic behavior, and a growing obsession with polygamy, which he claimed was a divine mandate that superseded the laws of both the church and the state. His increasingly extreme and unorthodox beliefs eventually led to his excommunication from the Latter-day Saint Church in the early 1990s, a rejection that did not deter him but rather accelerated his descent into a personalized, apocalyptic delusion in which he cast himself as a central prophetic figure. It was during this period of radicalization that Mitchell met Wanda Barzee, a woman who would become his willing accomplice and an essential enabler of his most heinous crimes. Wanda Irene Barzee was born in 1948 and was a deeply devout, socially isolated woman who had also been excommunicated from the church following her involvement with Mitchell. Barzee, who suffered from her own profound psychological disorders, including severe dependent personality disorder, became entirely subservient to Mitchell, surrendering her will, her identity, and her moral compass to his dominating personality. She accepted his self-proclaimed status as a prophet without question, embracing his increasingly bizarre and disturbing revelations as absolute truth. Together, Mitchell and Barzee adopted a lifestyle of extreme religious fanaticism, wandering the streets of Salt Lake City in handmade, biblical-style robes and sandals, preaching a garbled, apocalyptic gospel that blended elements of Latter-day Saint theology, polygamous fundamentalism, and Mitchell's own grandiose delusions. They lived in a state of transient squalor, moving between campsites, abandoned buildings, and the homes of sympathetic acquaintances, all while Mitchell refined and expanded his twisted theological framework to justify his escalating sexual predation. Central to Mitchell's delusional belief system was the concept of celestial marriage and the taking of multiple wives, which he claimed was a direct commandment from God that he was obligated to fulfill in order to achieve his prophetic destiny. This twisted theological justification became the direct motivation for the crime that would shock the nation. In the months leading up to the kidnapping, Mitchell had been stalking and fantasizing about a specific target, a young girl he believed had been divinely selected to become his celestial bride. That target was Elizabeth Ann Smart, a bright, musical, and deeply religious 14-year-old girl who lived with her large, loving family in an affluent neighborhood in the foothills of Salt Lake City. On the night of June 4, 2002, the Smart family was asleep in their home, a spacious, comfortable house that they believed was a safe haven for their 6 children. Elizabeth was sleeping in a bedroom she shared with her younger sister, Mary Catherine. In the early hours of the morning, Brian David Mitchell, armed with a knife, cut a screen window and climbed into the Smart home, moving silently through the darkened house until he reached the girl's bedroom. He awakened Elizabeth at knife point, whispering threats that he would kill her and her entire family if she made a sound. In a state of paralyzing terror, Elizabeth was forced to climb out the window and follow Mitchell into the dark, where Wanda Barzee was waiting. The three of them then walked for several miles through the upscale neighborhood, up into the rugged foothills above the city, until they reached a remote, heavily wooded campsite that Mitchell had prepared in advance. The psychological torment of Elizabeth Smart began the moment she was taken from her bed. Mitchell immediately initiated a brutal and systematic campaign to strip her of her identity, her will, and her connection to her family and her former life. He forced her to change into a handmaid, fringed robes similar to the ones he and Barzee wore, a visual symbol of her subjugation and her forced incorporation into his twisted religious worldview. He renamed her Shir Jashub, a biblical name that Mitchell claimed symbolized a remnant returning to God, but which in reality was a tool of identity erasure designed to sever her from the name and identity that connected her to her family and the life she had known. He then performed a bizarre, improvised ceremony that he declared was a celestial marriage, claiming that God had commanded him to take Elizabeth as his plural wife and that her captivity was not a kidnapping but a divine calling that she was obligated to obey. Over the ensuing 9 months, Mitchell subjected Elizabeth to a relentless, multi-layered regime of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse that was carefully designed to destroy her spirit and enforce her total submission. He frequently chained her to a tree with a metal cable, leaving her exposed to the harsh elements of the Utah wilderness for hours or even days at a time. He forced her to drink alcohol and watch pornographic material, acts that were deeply offensive to her religious beliefs and designed to violate her moral boundaries and induce a sense of profound shame and spiritual contamination. He raped her repeatedly, justifying the sexual abuse as a sacred religious rite and a prophetic entitlement. The psychological manipulation was equally devastating and sophisticated. Mitchell exerted absolute control over every aspect of Elizabeth's existence, dictating when she could speak, what she could say, and even what she could think. He told her repeatedly that her family did not want her back, that they had forgotten about her, and that God had rejected her, leaving him as her only source of salvation and protection. He threatened to kill her, her family, and anyone who tried to help her, instilling in her a paralyzing, all-consuming fear that prevented her from attempting to escape, even when opportunities presented themselves. Wanda Barzee played a crucial and deeply active role in the psychological torment, acting as Mitchell's enforcer and accomplice. She forced Elizabeth to perform menial and degrading chores, punished her for perceived infractions of Mitchell's arbitrary rules, and served as a psychological barrier between Elizabeth and any possibility of escape. Barzee's presence made the abuse a unified front, leaving Elizabeth feeling that there was no ally, no hope in her immediate environment. The investigation into Elizabeth Smart's disappearance was one of the largest and most intense in the history of the state of Utah. In the immediate aftermath of the kidnapping, the Salt Lake City Police Department, the FBI, and thousands of volunteers launched a massive search effort that encompassed the Smart neighborhood, the surrounding foothills, and the broader Salt Lake City area. The investigation generated thousands of leads, but the sheer volume of information, combined with a series of early investigative missteps, including the initial failure to properly identify and pursue the suspect sketch based on Mary Catherine Smart's description of the intruder, caused the case to stall. For months, there was no sign of Elizabeth, and the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. However, a critical breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mary Catherine Smart, the younger sister who had been in the bedroom during the kidnapping and had witnessed the intruder in the darkness, gradually realized that the man who had taken her sister was not a stranger, but someone she had seen before. She eventually identified the kidnapper as Emmanuel, a drifter who had occasionally performed odd jobs at the Smart home months before the kidnapping. This identification, which came several months into the investigation, provided detectives with their first solid lead. They were able to link the name Emmanuel to Brian David Mitchell, and a nationwide alert was issued for Mitchell and Barzee. Despite this breakthrough, Mitchell and Barzee remained at large for months, moving constantly through a vast and rugged landscape that spanned Utah, California, and Nevada. They lived in remote campsites, homeless encampments, and hidden shelters, always staying one step ahead of the law. During this period, Elizabeth was constantly visible in public, dressed in the distinctive robe and veil that Mitchell forced her to wear, yet the combination of the disguise, her own paralyzed fear, and the sheer number of transient individuals in the areas they traveled through meant that she was never recognized. The end of Elizabeth Smart's 9-month ordeal came on March 12, 2003, in the suburban community of Sandy, Utah, just south of Salt Lake City. Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth had returned to the Salt Lake area, and they were walking along a busy road when they were spotted by several individuals who had seen the media coverage of the case and recognized the distinctive robes. Among those who recognized them were 2 alert citizens who called the police. Officers from the Sandy Police Department responded immediately and stopped the trio. When officers approached and began questioning them, Mitchell was defiant and agitated, but Elizabeth, when separated from him and asked directly if she was Elizabeth Smart, finally, after 9 months of terror, answered in the affirmative. The relief and joy that swept through the Smart family and the entire community were profound and overwhelming. Elizabeth was reunited with her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, in an emotional scene that was broadcast to the nation. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were arrested on the spot, and the full, horrifying details of Elizabeth's captivity began to emerge. The legal proceedings that followed were protracted, complex, and deeply contentious, marked by a fierce battle over the mental competency of the defendants. Brian David Mitchell's legal strategy was to refuse to cooperate with his attorneys, sing religious hymns in the courtroom, disrupt proceedings with outbursts of prayer and prophecy, and maintain the delusional persona of a persecuted prophet. This behavior led to a series of competency hearings in which psychiatric experts debated whether Mitchell was genuinely psychotic and unable to understand the proceedings against him, or whether he was malingering, using his religious delusions as a calculated tactic to avoid trial. For years, the case bounced between state and federal courts, with judges ruling alternately that Mitchell was competent and incompetent to stand trial. It was not until 2010, 7 years after the kidnapping, that the case was finally resolved in federal court. A judge ruled that Mitchell was competent to stand trial, and the prosecution, led by a team from the United States Attorney's Office, presented a devastating case that included the powerful and dignified testimony of Elizabeth Smart herself, who described the kidnapping, the abuse, and the psychological torment with a clarity and composure that stunned the courtroom and the nation. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines for the purpose of illegal sexual activity. Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he was subsequently transferred to the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, where he remains in solitary confinement, isolated from the world he sought to dominate. Wanda Barzee, who had initially been declared incompetent to stand trial alongside Mitchell, eventually regained competency through medication and agreed to a plea deal in 2010. She pleaded guilty to charges of kidnapping and conspiracy, and in exchange for her cooperation with the prosecution against Mitchell, she was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. She was released in 2018, a decision that sparked controversy and outrage among victim advocacy groups who believed her sentence was grossly inadequate given her active and essential role in the 9-month ordeal. The aftermath of the Elizabeth Smart case was a transformative period for the young woman who had endured the unimaginable. Rather than retreating into silence and obscurity, Elizabeth chose to use her experience as a platform for advocacy and change. She established the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, an organization dedicated to educating communities about the prevention of child abduction and providing support to survivors of trauma and abuse. She became a prominent public speaker, sharing her story with audiences around the world with a message of hope, resilience, and the critical importance of never giving up on missing children. She authored a memoir detailing her ordeal, which became a bestseller, and she worked tirelessly to push for legislative changes, including the passage of the Amber Alert system improvements and stronger laws protecting children from sexual predators. Her advocacy also played a significant role in changing the public conversation about victim blaming and the stigma attached to survivors of sexual violence, challenging the pervasive and destructive myth that a victim's failure to escape is evidence of consent or complicity. The case of Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee stands as a powerful and deeply disturbing example of the weaponization of religious belief for the purpose of predation and control. It exposed the terrifying reality that a charismatic, delusional individual can manipulate the language and symbols of faith to justify the most heinous crimes and to exert a profound and devastating psychological hold over a vulnerable victim. It also demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and the capacity of a survivor to transform the deepest trauma into a powerful force for good in the world. The 9 months of darkness that Elizabeth Smart endured did not define her, but her courageous response to that darkness has defined a generation of advocacy and a legacy of hope that continues to inspire and empower survivors around the world. Number 9, Omaima Nelson, an Egyptian-born model who lured a man into a web of fatal seduction, subjecting him to a prolonged nightmare of physical and psychological torture before dismembering his remains in a grisly act of post-mortem domination that horrified the nation and exposed the terrifying intersection of beauty, predation, and absolute rage. Omaima Ari Nelson was born in Egypt in the late 1960s and raised in a culture where she was taught to aspire to a life of domesticity and submission, expectations she fiercely rejected from a young age. Possessing a striking, almost arresting physical beauty, Omaima leveraged her looks to escape the constraints of her upbringing, embarking on a tumultuous journey that took her from the Middle East to Europe and eventually to the United States, where she pursued a career in modeling and entertainment. She was a woman of sharp contrasts, capable of presenting a dazzling, exotic, and charming facade to the world while harboring a deep well of anger, jealousy, and emotional instability that simmered just beneath the surface. Her personal history was littered with failed relationships, volatile confrontations, and accusations of violence, patterns that pointed to a profoundly disturbed individual capable of extreme and dangerous behavior when her desires were thwarted or her sense of control was threatened. Before her arrival in the United States, Omaima had been married multiple times, and these relationships were marked by intense conflict and allegations of abuse from both sides. She moved to the United States in the late 1980s, settling initially in Florida before relocating to Southern California, the epicenter of the modeling and entertainment industries, where she believed her beauty and ambition would finally be recognized and rewarded. In California, she worked sporadically as a model, a lingerie saleswoman, and a companion, eking out a living on the fringes of the glamorous world she desperately sought to enter. It was in this environment of superficiality, competition, and unfulfilled ambition that Omaima's predatory instincts found their most lethal expression. In late 1991, Omaima Nelson, who was then in her early 20s, met William Earl Nelson, a 56-year-old retired pilot and businessman, at a bar in Costa Mesa, California. William Nelson was a successful, affluent, and relatively lonely man who was immediately captivated by Omaima's exotic beauty, her youthful energy, and her intense, almost overwhelming attentiveness. He was a man who had experienced the ups and downs of life, including a previous marriage that had ended in divorce, and he was vulnerable to the flattery and seduction that Omaima deployed with surgical precision. The two began dating, and the relationship progressed with a dizzying speed that, in retrospect, was a clear indicator of Omaima's manipulative agenda. Within weeks of meeting, William, who was thoroughly enchanted by Omaima, proposed marriage, and the two were married in a quick ceremony in November 1991. For William, the marriage was a second chance at happiness, an opportunity to share his wealth, his comfortable home, and his life with a beautiful, vibrant younger woman. For Omaima, the marriage was a calculated transaction, a means of securing financial stability, social status, and access to the comfortable lifestyle she craved. However, the facade of marital bliss crumbled almost immediately after the wedding. Omaima's true nature, which she had carefully concealed during the courtship, emerged with a terrifying intensity. She became insanely jealous, controlling, and volatile, accusing William of infidelity with no evidence, monitoring his movements, and flying into violent rages over perceived slights. She demanded that he change his will to leave his entire estate to her, a demand that he initially resisted, creating a source of bitter conflict between them. The relationship deteriorated rapidly into a toxic, combustible mixture of greed, paranoia, and rage, a powder keg that was destined to explode. The events of the night of November 28, 1991, the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, marked the culmination of the escalating violence and the beginning of a horror that defies comprehension. According to the testimony that would later emerge at trial, Omaima initiated a sexual encounter with William that evening, but the encounter was not an act of intimacy but rather a predatory trap. During the course of the encounter, Omema attacked William, binding him to the bed with handcuffs and silk scarves, rendering him helpless. What followed was a prolonged and sadistic ordeal of torture and psychological torment that lasted for hours. Omema, who had been seething with resentment and rage toward William for weeks, unleashed a campaign of extreme violence upon her bound and defenseless husband. She beat him severely, using her hands, fists, and a variety of household objects, including a clothes iron and a sculpture, to inflict devastating injuries. She burned him with the hot iron, leaving deep, searing wounds on his skin. She bit him repeatedly, leaving deep, bloody bite marks all over his body, including his genitals, a signature act of savagery that would later serve as crucial forensic evidence. She taunted him, humiliated him, and psychologically terrorized him throughout the ordeal, refusing to let him free and ignoring his pleas for mercy. The prolonged nature of the torture, which was not a sudden explosion of violence but a sustained, methodical campaign of brutality, indicates a level of premeditation and emotional fury that is deeply chilling. William Nelson eventually died from the massive injuries he sustained during the hours-long ordeal, a death that was neither quick nor merciful but the culmination of a prolonged and deliberate act of lethal sadism. The horror, however, did not end with William's death. In a gesture of ultimate dominance and desecration, Omema Nelson proceeded to dismember her husband's body in the kitchen of their Costa Mesa apartment. Using a carving knife, a circular saw, and a pair of electric shears, she systematically dismantled William's remains, severing his limbs, his head, and his torso into multiple pieces. The act of dismemberment, which was carried out with a degree of calm and methodical precision that shocked even veteran forensic investigators, was not merely a pragmatic attempt to dispose of the body but a profound act of psychological control, a final, grotesque assertion of total power over her victim. She then set about concealing the evidence of her crime in a series of bizarre and macabre actions that revealed the depth of her disturbed psyche. She boiled some of the body parts, including the head, in pots on the stove, an act she later claimed was an attempt to dissolve the flesh. She placed other body parts in plastic garbage bags and stored them in the refrigerator and freezer, alongside the Thanksgiving leftovers. She disposed of some remains in the trash bins of the apartment complex and in a nearby dumpster. She even attempted to cook and eat some of the flesh, an act of cannibalism that, while difficult to conclusively prove in court, was suggested by the testimony of witnesses and the peculiar condition of some of the remains, adding a layer of primal horror to an already grotesque crime. The investigation into William Nelson's disappearance began when his friends and business associates, who had not heard from him for several days, became concerned and contacted the police. When officers from the Costa Mesa Police Department arrived at the apartment to conduct a welfare check, they were greeted by Omema, who appeared calm and composed and told them that William had left after an argument and that she did not know where he was. However, the officers noticed a strong, unpleasant odor emanating from the apartment and observed spots of what appeared to be blood on the carpet and furniture. These observations, combined with Omema's evasive and inconsistent answers to their questions, raised their suspicions sufficiently to obtain a search warrant. When investigators returned with the warrant and conducted a thorough search of the apartment, they discovered the horrific evidence of the crime. In the kitchen, they found pots on the stove containing boiled body parts, including a portion of the skull. In the refrigerator and freezer, they discovered plastic bags containing severed limbs and other tissue. In the trash bins outside the apartment, they found additional remains that Omema had attempted to discard. The apartment was a grisly crime scene, a charnel house that bore witness to an act of violence and desecration of almost incomprehensible savagery. Omema Nelson was arrested on the scene and charged with murder. During her interrogation and throughout the subsequent legal proceedings, Omema maintained a defense that was as bizarre and disturbing as the crime itself. She claimed that she had been a victim of severe domestic violence at the hands of William Nelson and that the killing had been an act of self-defense during a violent altercation in which he had attempted to rape and kill her. She denied dismembering the body, initially claiming that she had no memory of the events following the alleged struggle, a claim that was entirely contradicted by the physical evidence. She later changed her story, admitting to the dismemberment but claiming that she had acted in a state of dissociative shock and had no recollection of the specific details. She also claimed that she had been influenced by a history of childhood abuse in Egypt and that she suffered from various psychological disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative identity disorder, which impaired her ability to control her actions. The prosecution, led by Senior Deputy District Attorney Paul K. Chrysopoulos, systematically dismantled Omeima's self-defense claim by presenting a mountain of forensic evidence that painted a picture not of a frightened woman defending herself, but of a calculated, sadistic predator who had lured her victim into a trap and tortured him over a prolonged period. The forensic evidence, which was presented by a team of expert witnesses, was devastating. The bite marks on William's body were matched to Omeima's dental impressions with absolute certainty. The pattern and severity of the injuries, including the burns from the iron, the blunt force trauma, and the defensive wounds on William's hands and arms, indicated a sustained, one-sided assault, not a mutual struggle. The presence of the handcuffs and restraints, which Omeima had used to bind William before the assault began, completely undermined her claim of self-defense, as they demonstrated premeditation and an intent to incapacitate the victim before the violence began. Furthermore, the prosecution presented evidence of Omeima's motive, highlighting her demands that William change his will, her extravagant spending in the days following the murder, and her attempts to cash checks and access his financial accounts in the immediate aftermath of his death. The trial of Omeima Nelson, which took place in 1993 in Santa Ana, California, was a sensational and deeply disturbing proceeding that drew intense media coverage from around the world. The jury was presented with a stark choice between the prosecution's portrait of a cold, calculating, and sadistic killer and the defense's portrait of a damaged, traumatized woman who had snapped under the pressure of abuse. The jury deliberated for a relatively short period before returning a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that reflected their finding that the killing was intentional but did not meet the specific legal criteria for first-degree murder with special circumstances, a decision that was met with some controversy given the extreme and premeditated nature of the crime. Omeima Nelson was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, a sentence that, while significant, was criticized by many as being insufficient given the horrific circumstances of the crime, particularly the prolonged torture, the dismemberment, and the suspected cannibalism. The aftermath of the trial saw Omeima Nelson become a figure of enduring fascination and horror in the annals of American true crime. Her case has been studied extensively by criminologists, forensic psychologists, and legal scholars as a rare and disturbing example of a female perpetrator of extreme, sadistic violence, a pattern that, while less common than male-perpetrated violence, is no less devastating in its impact. The case challenged prevailing societal assumptions about gender and violence, forcing a recognition that women, like men, are capable of the most extreme and depraved acts of aggression when fueled by a combination of psychological disturbance, emotional rage, and a desire for control. Omeima Nelson remains incarcerated in the California prison system, having been repeatedly denied parole due to the extreme and unrepentant nature of her crime. Her appearances before parole boards have been marked by a continued lack of remorse and a persistent attempt to portray herself as the victim, a posture that has ensured that she will likely remain behind bars for the remainder of her natural life. The case of Omeima Nelson stands as a chilling and unforgettable reminder that the capacity for human cruelty is not confined by gender, culture, or circumstance, and that the most terrifying monsters can wear the most beautiful and alluring faces. It is a story that exposes the dark underbelly of seduction, greed, and rage, and a testament to the enduring power of forensic science and determined prosecution to bring even the most horrific crimes to light and hold the perpetrators accountable, no matter how elaborate or grotesque their attempts to conceal the truth. Number 10, Leonard Fraser, a predatory brute who terrorized the Australian community of Rockhampton for decades, leaving a trail of disappeared women in his wake before his final, frenzied capture exposed a pattern of prolonged captivity, sadistic torture, and murder that made him one of the most reviled figures in the nation's criminal history. Leonard George Fraser was born on June 27, 1951, in the town of Ingham in the tropical northern reaches of Queensland, Australia, a rough, working-class environment where violence, alcoholism, and poverty were endemic. From his earliest years, Fraser exhibited a deeply disturbing pattern of violent and antisocial behavior that set him apart from his peers and marked him as a dangerous and damaged individual. He was raised in a deeply dysfunctional household characterized by severe neglect, physical abuse, and chronic instability, factors that, while not excusing his subsequent actions, contributed to the formation of a profoundly psychopathic personality devoid of empathy, remorse, or any respect for human life. Fraser's childhood was punctuated by episodes of extreme cruelty toward animals and other children, behaviors that are widely recognized by criminologists and psychologists as early warning signs of a developing predatory personality. As he grew into adolescence and young adulthood, his violent tendencies escalated dramatically, fueled by a chronic and severe alcohol addiction that further eroded any remaining impulse control he possessed. His criminal history began in his teenage years and expanded rapidly into a staggering catalog of violent offenses that spanned the entirety of his adult life. Fraser's rap sheet, which would eventually fill dozens of pages, included convictions for assault, armed robbery, sexual assault, rape, and multiple counts of kidnapping. He was a large, physically imposing man with a menacing presence and a hair-trigger temper that made him terrifying to those who crossed his path. He was known in the criminal underworld and among the vulnerable communities of central Queensland as a brute, a man who used his physical size and his capacity for violence to intimidate, control, and dominate those around him, particularly women. He frequented the rough pubs, boarding houses, and marginalized neighborhoods of the region, preying upon the most vulnerable members of society, women who were homeless, addicted to drugs or alcohol, or otherwise isolated from the protective structures of family and community. These women, who existed on the fringes of Australian society, were Fraser's preferred targets because he correctly calculated that their disappearance would generate minimal public outcry and inadequate police attention, a calculation that allowed him to offend with impunity for decades. Fraser's criminal career was punctuated by a series of horrific sexual assaults and kidnappings that, in a more just and vigilant system, should have resulted in his permanent incapacitation. In 1974, he was convicted of the rape and vicious assault of a young woman in Rockhampton, a crime for which he received a relatively lenient sentence that reflected the inadequate sentencing practices of the era. In the 1980s, he was convicted of another violent sexual assault, and in the 1990s, he was again imprisoned for a brutal attack on a woman whom he had lured to an isolated location. Each time he was released from prison, he returned to the streets of Rockhampton and the surrounding region, and each time, his predatory behavior escalated in severity and audacity. The systemic failures that allowed Fraser to remain a free man despite his extensive and worsening criminal history are a damning indictment of the Queensland criminal justice system of the period, a system that repeatedly failed to recognize the irredeemable and escalating nature of his dangerousness. The period between 1998 and 1999 represented the darkest and most violent chapter of Leonard Fraser's life, a period in which he embarked on a campaign of kidnapping, torture, and murder that left the city of Rockhampton paralyzed with fear. During this time, a number of women disappeared from the streets of Rockhampton under circumstances that pointed to a single, predatory killer. Among the victims were Sylvia Benedetti, a 40-year-old woman who vanished in December 1998, and Beverly Legg, a 37-year-old woman who disappeared in April 1999. The disappearances of these women, who were all vulnerable, marginalized individuals with connections to the street culture of Rockhampton, initially generated only a modest police response, a failure that reflected the systemic bias and inadequate prioritization of missing persons cases involving marginalized populations that has plagued law enforcement agencies around the world. However, as the number of missing women grew, the community's alarm intensified, and the police were forced to acknowledge that a serial predator was operating in their midst. The investigation, which was eventually designated as a major criminal investigation, was hampered by a lack of forensic evidence, a lack of cooperation from witnesses who were terrified of Fraser, and a lack of resources and expertise that plagued the small regional police force. The breakthrough in the investigation came in a manner that was both dramatic and deeply disturbing, exposing not only Fraser's guilt but also the horrifying, prolonged nature of his predatory methods. In December 1999, a 9-year-old girl, whose identity has been protected by the courts and is known only by the pseudonym Chantal, was abducted by Fraser from a Rockhampton street. Fraser took the child to a derelict, abandoned house in a remote area on the outskirts of the city, where he imprisoned her in a dark, squalid room and subjected her to a terrifying ordeal of physical and sexual abuse. The details of the child's captivity, which emerged later during the trial, were so horrific that they shocked even the most seasoned investigators and courtroom professionals. Fraser bound the girl, beat her, and sexually assaulted her over a prolonged period, subjecting her to the same sadistic regime of terror and domination that he had inflicted upon his adult victims. However, in a twist of fate that saved the child's life and sealed Fraser's doom, Chantal managed to escape from the abandoned house while Fraser was temporarily distracted. She fled into the surrounding bushland, barefoot and injured, and eventually stumbled upon a nearby residence where she raised the alarm. The police were called immediately, and a massive manhunt for Fraser was launched. He was arrested a short time later, hiding in a nearby property, and was taken into custody. The arrest of Leonard Fraser for the abduction and assault of the 9-year-old girl provided investigators with the critical leverage they needed to finally dismantle his decades-long campaign of terror. During his interrogation, and in the subsequent forensic investigation of his known haunts, hideouts, and dumping sites, police uncovered a mountain of evidence linking Fraser not only to the abduction of Chantal but to the murders and disappearances of multiple women in the Rockhampton area. Forensic teams discovered the remains of Sylvia Benedetti and Beverly Legg at separate sites near Rockhampton, and the condition of the remains, which showed signs of extreme trauma and post-mortem mutilation, confirmed the horrific nature of the crimes. Fraser was also linked to the murder of a third woman, Julie Dawn Turner, whose remains were discovered in a shallow grave. Additionally, investigators were able to connect Fraser to the earlier murder of a woman named Kira Steinhardt, a young girl who had been brutally murdered in Rockhampton in 1999, a crime that had initially been attributed to another suspect but was now firmly linked to Fraser through DNA evidence and witness testimony. The sheer scale and depravity of Fraser's crimes, which spanned decades and involved multiple victims, left the Rockhampton community and the entire Australian nation in a state of profound shock and outrage. The legal proceedings against Leonard Fraser were complex, protracted, and deeply harrowing, reflecting the massive scale and extreme severity of the charges against him. He was ultimately tried in the Supreme Court of Queensland on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and a host of other charges related to his decades-long campaign of terror. The prosecution, led by a team of senior Crown prosecutors, presented a devastating case that included the forensic evidence linking Fraser to the remains of the murdered women, the powerful and courageous testimony of the surviving victim, Chantal, whose detailed account of her abduction and captivity provided a chilling window into Fraser's methods and psychology, and the testimony of numerous witnesses who had either witnessed Fraser's violent behavior or had been victims of his earlier uncharged crimes. The defense, hamstrung by the overwhelming evidence, attempted to argue that Fraser suffered from various mental disorders that impaired his capacity to control his actions, but the court-appointed psychiatrists who evaluated Fraser rejected this argument, concluding that he was not mentally ill in the legal sense but was instead a man with a severe antisocial personality disorder who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. In 2003, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts, and Leonard Fraser was sentenced to indefinite life imprisonment, a sentence that reflected the court's finding that he was an irredeemable danger to the community who should never be released. The judge, in handing down the sentence, described Fraser's crimes as among the most horrific and depraved ever to come before the court, a sentiment that was echoed by the entire Australian community. The aftermath of the Fraser case was a painful and necessary reckoning for the city of Rockhampton and the Queensland criminal justice system. The case exposed the devastating consequences of a system that had repeatedly failed to protect the most vulnerable members of society, allowing a known, violent, and escalating predator to remain free to offend over a period of decades. It prompted a major review of the policies and procedures for monitoring and managing violent sexual offenders in Queensland, leading to significant reforms in the areas of sentencing, parole, and community supervision. It also forced a long overdue conversation about the value and dignity of the lives of marginalized women, the women who had been Fraser's primary targets, and the urgent need for law enforcement to prioritize and adequately resource missing persons cases involving vulnerable populations, regardless of their social status or lifestyle. For the surviving victim, Chantal, the journey of healing from the trauma of her abduction and captivity has been a long and profoundly difficult process, one that has required immense courage, resilience, and the support of dedicated trauma specialists and a loving family. Her miraculous escape from Fraser's clutches, which not only saved her own life but also led to the capture and conviction of a serial killer, stands as a testament to the extraordinary courage and resourcefulness of a child in the most terrifying of circumstances. Leonard Fraser died in prison on January 1, 2007, at the age of 55, from a suspected heart attack, a quiet and unremarkable end for a man who had caused so much suffering, terror, and death. His death brought a final, definitive closure to a case that had haunted the Australian consciousness for years, but the scars he left on his victims, their families, and the community of Rockhampton will endure for generations. The case of Leonard Fraser stands as one of the most disturbing and consequential in Australian criminal history, a grim and powerful reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who have been enabled by a system's failures, and that the protection of the most vulnerable members of society is not merely a theoretical ideal but a non-negotiable moral and practical imperative that requires constant vigilance, adequate resources, and an unwavering commitment to justice.